excited to have you here, my next speaker. He's been my speaker before in the past, and I'm totally in tune with what he talks about. He cares about both your health and your lifestyle, including fitness as well, which those are my things too. So I really, really enjoy Dr. Joseph Keon. He's got quite a background. He's an environmental medicine researcher and an author. He's a fitness expert with the Cooper Institute for Aerobics and for Aerobics Research and the American Council on Exercise. He's a wellness consultant now for over 20 years, focusing on the chronic degenerative diseases and their relationships to our lifestyle choices. So he's on the board of directors of the Wild Oats Wellness and Dr. Helen Caldicott's Nuclear Policy Research Institute. He's on local and national broadcasts like Martha Stewart, CBS, ABC, and he's featured in the Environmental Magazine, San Francisco Chronicle, Positive Health Magazine, and the list goes on. So I'm going to stop there. But he's the author of Whole Health, The Truth About Breast Cancer. And one of my favorite books is called Whitewash, which is the cow's milk and relationship to breast cancer as well. And he has a silver medal award with that book, and he was featured as Book of the Year in Veg News Magazine. And with that, I'm going to have you listen to Dr. Joseph Keon about Alzheimer's and prevention, which I think is so wonderful to hear, because none of us want to go out that way. I have friends who went out with Alzheimer's, and it is the most devastating way to die, because you're there, but your mind isn't. And I can't tell you how horrible it is for everybody living around that person. So with that, I want to give you, who can help us with that is Dr. Joseph Keon.
Good morning. Thank you, Linda. There is a tsunami coming. It's out on the horizon, and it's building in size and scope. And when it reaches us, it's going to blanket the entire United States. And behind in its wake, it's going to leave a socio-economic disaster. It's going to rob our society of great artists, entertainers, economists, musicians, political leaders, scientists, and school teachers alike. It's going to bankrupt Medicare, and it's going to render us an emotionally depleted society. Now, there are those in the government and scientific communities who see this impending disaster. They know it's headed our way. But rather than take robust action now to protect as many people as possible, they're mired in debate, distraction, and inaction. Now, some of them in the scientific community know there are specific things one can do to lower their risk of succumbing. But instead of empowering people with that wisdom, they're waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to come along with a scientific insight to somehow stop this tsunami in its track and render it harmless. Now, the tsunami I speak of is, of course, Alzheimer's disease, and its threat to our society is beyond what most people can begin to imagine. So I'm going to give you a preview of what's headed our way. Now, some people believe that if you live long enough, you're bound to develop dementia, and they shrug it off. They see it as an inevitability of aging. Others have been led to believe that they have no risk because they took a genetic test on the internet and were told that they don't carry a risk gene. But still, many others are deeply concerned about the thought of developing Alzheimer's disease. Why is this disease so frightening? Because it's so much more than forgetting the name of a loved one or the location of your car keys. Who we are today is a compilation of all of our memories, our experiences beginning from the earliest stages of our life, schooling, travel, people who have loved us, those whom we've loved, books we've read, stories we've been told, praise we've received, and traumas we've endured. And the thoughts and feelings that have followed these experiences have shaped the person that we've become. And those thoughts inform the choices and decisions that we make on a daily basis. So when we talk about losing our memory, some have likened it to the erosion of our essential nature. Now, today, you and I are living at an unprecedented time when it comes to this disease. In 2020, while we were all so distracted by the COVID-19 pandemic, a startling report was released that received relatively little attention. I think it should have been on the front page of every newspaper in America. Drawing on the data from the 48 million Americans they insure, the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association reported that just between 2013 and 2017, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 44 to 50-year-old Americans increased 300%. Worse, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 30 to 44-year-old Americans increased 370%. Now, I want to make sure you got what I just said. In a mere 5-year window, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 30 to 44-year-old Americans increased 370%.
Oh,
People at age 30 often have not met their life's partner yet, begun to build a family. Some are still working to solidify their career. Now, unless we change our trajectory, soon enough, chances are that if you're not facing a diagnosis yourself, you're going to be facing one in a family member, a friend, or a loved one. What's unfolding right now is a calamity that presently costs us $300 billion a year and is projected to reach $1 trillion a year. And that's why this disease will single-handedly bankrupt Medicare. Now, as a comparison, we presently spend $700 billion a year on the world's largest military defense budget. Now, as increasingly younger Americans are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, our workforce is going to suffer significant attrition, not just to those who must withdraw from their work because of their own diagnosis, but to many more who will have to retire prematurely in order to care for a family member or a loved one. Because after all, the lion's share of all the care that's provided to Alzheimer's patients is done so by family members for free. Now, those caregivers themselves become a secondary cohort with illnesses of their own because of the discouraging circumstances they work in, because they're not able to earn a living. They become financially distressed, they become socially isolated, and they frequently become depressed. And this is a whole nother set of people that now need care. They need attention themselves.
yeah.
So if you talk to a lot of health officials today, many will tell you that we don't know the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And without something to assign cause to and address, we become distracted by, even preoccupied with, two things: genes and pharmaceutical drugs, both of which are useless to prevent a disease, and they serve as this distraction from what each one of us can be doing today. So I want to talk about both of these before we go further forward and disabuse you of some of the mythology around both. Now, have you taken one of these internet genetic tests? Because a lot of Americans have. And people can get a false sense of security or dread from such tests. For example, just because you're told you don't carry the dreaded ApoE4 gene doesn't mean you're free of risk. And likewise, the presence of the gene carries no certainty of a future diagnosis. Now, a landmark study of 20,000 twin pairs demonstrates that genetics are not the sole determiner of risk. The study found that if Alzheimer's developed in one of identical male twins, the other twin only developed it 45% of the time, 60% of the time if they were female. Further, there could be as much as a 16-year difference in the age of onset, as well as differences in the severity of the disease. Now remember, identical twins have identical genes, so there must be some other factor to account for these discrepancies. Now, researchers described one twin pair in particular in which one of the brothers was occupationally exposed to pesticides. He developed Alzheimer's at age 60, relatively early, and endured that disease for 16 years before passing away. His brother, cognitively intact, developed cancer 20 years later. Now, when both of these brothers' brains were looked at under autopsy, of course, the first brother's brain, as expected, was riddled with the pathological features of Alzheimer's, neurofibrillary tangles, amyloid plaques, etc. However, in the second brother's brain, they had to comb through it forensically just to find one neurofibrillary tangle. Japanese natives who move to Hawaii and adopt the local lifestyle of their new homeland see a precipitous rise in their chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. And a similar tendency is seen in Africans who move from Nigeria to the US. So one could be cognitively healthy in one society, move to another location, and their risk of becoming disease goes up significantly. So if one stays in Nigeria, for example, their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is 5 times lower than if they move to Los Angeles and reside there. And an interesting fact about Nigeria is that population has the highest known frequency of the ApoE4 gene. So one would assume that they would have, well, an Alzheimer's hotspot in that society, but they don't.
Oh.
They have a relatively low incidence of Alzheimer's, and we can look at that later on. Now, the rapidly growing field of epigenetics challenges the belief that we don't have any influence over our genetic heritage. Now, the epi prefix simply means something on top of or in addition to genetics. And what we're learning is that our environment and our personal lifestyle can change what's called gene expression. So our genome can be thought of as like a genetic blueprint, okay? Mm-hmm. But it's dynamic and it's responsive to its environment. So the choices that we make today about nutrition, about how much exercise we get, how we respond to stressors in our life, and our exposure to toxins can turn genes on or off, and thereby change how our cells read the genes, how they interact together, and ultimately influence our risk. Mm-hmm. Now, this is clearly illustrated in a 21-year-long Swedish study. The researchers discovered that, yes, if you carried one copy of the ApoE4 gene, your risk of developing Alzheimer's was about 2.8 times higher on average. But when they factored in alcohol consumption, smoking, sedentary living or not exercising, and a typical high-fat American diet, the risk increased over 10-fold. Ooh. So this study illustrates the adage, genes load the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. Now let's look at the other distraction, which is pharmaceutical drugs, okay? When it comes to pharmaceuticals, the landscape for the last 30 years has been dismal. Tens of billions of dollars have been poured into this research to try and develop a drug that will somehow erase the pathology of Alzheimer's and restore one's cognitive health. Today, the best thing we've got are symptomatic treatments that give a patient maybe 6 to 12 months of feeling just a little bit better, but they do nothing for the underlying disease. After 99 trials with 24 different drugs, Pfizer, the world's third largest pharmaceutical company, packed up their tent and walked away from Alzheimer's research. They said they're simply not making reasonable headway to justify the investment expenditure that they've been making. And this is really concerning. In 2020, you probably read about Biogen because they've been in the news a lot. They've got a drug which they're seeking approval for, and it doesn't look promising. An FDA advisory board, 10 of the 11 members said that the company hadn't submitted sufficient evidence of efficacy for the drug. Now, it's in an extended review, I think, for another 2 months, because there's a lot of hope resting on this getting approval. We haven't had a drug approved in almost 20 years.
Oh my goodness.
244 drugs have been tested with no success.
No.
Now, don't get me wrong. We need a blockbuster drug that can help those who've already been given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. But while we wait out this fantastically complicated and wildly expensive process of developing one, we should be empowering people with the wisdom that we have on hand, because prevention is always better than a cure. Now, long-term studies from researchers around the world have come to fruition recently and have brought us to an inflection point. We now see that Alzheimer's disease, according to this research, we could probably prevent up to 60% of cases and maybe even more by just addressing a handful of risk factors, lifestyle factors.
Really?
But in my book, The Forthcoming Alzheimer's Revolution, I look at many more factors, including emerging risk factors, I call them, factors that aren't even on the radar screen yet, and that people typically don't consider when they think of Alzheimer's risk. So today, in our limited time, I've selected a few that I want to talk to you about. And the reason I've chosen them is they are widespread concerns in our society, but they're not frequently considered risk factors or associated with Alzheimer's disease. And I want to begin by talking to you about high blood pressure. High blood pressure now affects 1 in 2 American adults, and it's predictive of future dementia. Now, blood pressure readings are just a measure of how hard blood is pushing against the walls of your arteries. And we know that as pressure goes up, a whole range of things take place that place our health at risk, particularly our brain. What happens is blood pressure goes up, it reduces blood flow to the brain. And with reduced blood flow is reduced oxygen. So our brain cells are deprived of adequate oxygen. What follows is inflammation in the brain, neuroinflammation, and as we know, inflammation is present from the earliest stages of Alzheimer's all the way into the latest stages of the disease. Inflammation changes the structure and functional elements of neurons. And something else it does, with lots of inflammation sustained in the brain shrinks at an accelerated rate, setting the stage for future dementia.
Really?
And compromising cognition in the earlier phases. So why is the brain shrinking? You're losing neurons, brain cells, and you're losing synapses, the junctions in between them. So overall volume is being lost. High blood pressure also damages blood vessels in the brain, even the microvasculature, the little capillaries. And as these blood vessels get damaged, you increase the chance of microbleeds or mini strokes to occur. They're imperceptible. I could be having one right now as I speak.
Really?
However, at autopsy, when you look at the brain of someone who's passed away with Alzheimer's, you see these little, they're peppered with these zones of necrotic tissue where the cells have been killed off, the brain cells have died. Now, the good news that we have on blood pressure and Alzheimer's is if you treat it with hypertensive medication, you can lower your risk of developing Alzheimer's by 50 to 70% compared to someone who leaves their compared to someone who leaves their high blood pressure untreated. Even if somebody has mild cognitive impairment, which is often the precursor to Alzheimer's disease, treating blood pressure reduces the chance that they will convert to Alzheimer's later on.
Wow.
So what's the remedy? Yes, they're medications. Do we have to take them? In most cases, not. In most cases, lifestyle is what changes blood pressure because lifestyle is what caused blood pressure to go up. Dietary changes can lower your blood pressure in as little as 2 weeks. Okay? That's powerful medicine.
Yeah.
A diet that is rich in total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, hardens and narrows the arteries, which makes it harder for your heart to pump blood through them, reduces the amount of blood reaching the brain.
Makes
right?
sense.
That diet creates inflammation in the endothelial cells that line the arterial walls and just sets the stages for trouble all around. We know, of course, it increases the risk of stroke and heart attack as well. But the scientific literature is replete with studies affirming that one can swiftly lower their blood pressure by adopting a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet gives our arteries a chance to clean themselves up, plaques in the arteries regress, inflammation subsides, the arteries become more flexible, more blood and oxygen reaches the brain to feed cells, and it works in a dose-dependent manner. So if you say, well, I'm going to eliminate meat, but I'm going to still eat eggs and cheese, you're not going to lower your blood pressure as much as you could, and you should. When you make comprehensive dietary changes and you focus entirely on a plant-based diet, you're going to see your blood pressure drop precipitously. Now, there are other things you can do as well. Exercise. Lower your blood pressure 4 to 9 points just from exercising 5 times a week for 30 minutes. It doesn't matter what you do, as long as it raises your heart rate. that it's aerobic, running, swimming, elliptical, stair climbing, what have you. Weight loss is also powerful in lowering blood pressure. For every 20 pounds one loses, you can lose 5 to 20 points off your blood pressure.
Really? Wow.
And stress management. We're never going to get rid of stressors, but we can change how we respond to stress. If we respond in a negative manner, we boost cortisol levels, and cortisol we refer to as a stress hormone because it increases blood pressure. It constricts blood vessels. Salt. 5,000 years ago, the Chinese were writing about how diet with too much salt and increased blood pressure, but we didn't get the memo, at least not yet. The CDC says 90% of us consume way too much salt. And as a result, our kidneys can't remove the water from our blood volume goes up, and that again causes elevated blood pressure. So we use salt and sodium interchangeably, but what we're really talking about is sodium. Table salt is 60% chloride, 40% sodium. It's sodium that's really creating the problem. Alcohol raises blood pressure by reducing vasodilators in the blood. Those are substances that open up the diameter of our arteries and let blood flow more freely. And then finally, smoking. When we smoke, we take in about 2,000 different chemicals that can create all sorts of havoc in the body. But nicotine itself constricts blood vessels and thereby increases blood pressure. So there's a variety of ways of addressing it. Number one, most important, diet, okay? The second risk factor I want to talk to you about is overweight and obesity. And here's why. 239 million Americans are now overweight or obese. That's 73% of our population. And it increases the risk of Alzheimer's twofold, okay? Studies show that as one adds more and more weight, by the time they're 50, cognitive decline settles in earlier and earlier as weight goes up. What's happening? Systemic inflammation. There's the inflammation again I spoke about earlier. As inflammation goes up, what else happens? The brain shrinks at an accelerated rate. We see this in obesity and heavy weight gain, especially the part of the brain called the hippocampus. This is the region that is assaulted in Alzheimer's disease. It is the epicenter of memory and emotion. So overweight compromises the blood-brain barrier, increasing the likelihood that something will enter into the brain that shouldn't and triggering a local immune reaction in the brain. When we use imaging, MRI, PET scans, etc., and autopsies, we can look at the brains of people who died with obesity, and their brains are aged about 10 years additionally. 10-year older brain. So if they die at 50, their brain looks physically as though it's 60 years old. If they die at 60, it looks like it's 70 years old.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Obesity and overweight increase the risk of diabetes, and that's a major risk factor for Alzheimer's in itself. If one has the terrible trifecta, which is high blood pressure, obesity, and high cholesterol, the risk may be as high as 6 times greater. So what's the remedy? Generally speaking, Americans are eating more of the very foods that make weight gain easy and weight loss difficult. Fat-laden meat and cheese, and of course, sugary drinks of all kind. Now, these are foods that are really calorie dense versus calorie dilute. And 100 years ago, we only ate about 120 pounds of meat per person a year. Today, it's 270 per person every year. Same thing with cheese. Back then, we ate about 4 pounds of cheese per year. Now it's 36 pounds of cheese.
Wow.
1980, we ate about 57 pounds of fat per year per person. By 2005, it was 85 pounds of fat per person a year.
Oh,
when your diet is composed of calorie-dilute foods, starches, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, you end up full, feeling satisfied, but consuming significantly less calories. If you consume a surplus of 500 calories a day, that's good for an extra pound added by the end of a week. 7 days, 3,500 calories, an additional pound. So many of us are just anchored to furniture all day long, right? We move from a desk that we've sat at for maybe 8 hours a day to a car to sit in a chair for maybe an hour commute. We come home, we sit at the dinner table in a chair for an hour. Then we move to a recliner in front of the TV for maybe 2 hours. And then we move to a bed for hopefully 7 or 8 hours. We've got to find time. We've got to make time to exercise our bodies. burn the excess calories, and get all the other benefits that I'm going to talk to you about in a moment when it comes to reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Theoretically, if you burn 500 additional calories a day, in 7 days, you'll have lost a pound. In theory, again, in a year, you're talking about a 52-pound weight loss. 90-minute walk or a brisk walk of 4 miles per hour, you're going to lose. You could walk just in an hour to burn 500 calories, an hour of tennis, an hour of full court basketball, 1.5 hour hike in the woods, or an hour of swimming. It's the aerobic exercise that's most important. Okay, so repeatedly, research has shown over and over, when you pull all the gimmicks and games away of the branded services that are offering weight loss assistance, it really comes down to eating healthful foods within the calorie needs that we actually have, and combined with regular exercise that helps us achieve sustained weight loss for life. Now, physical activity is another risk factor I want to talk to you about, because the US is more sedentary than ever before. Less than 5% of Americans exercise every day. And this is a potent ally in your effort to ward off dementia and maintain brain resilience. And one of the most important reasons is when we exercise, we boost a compound called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. It's been likened to miracle grow for the brain. It promotes something called neurogenesis, which is the production of new neurons, new brain cells. Okay? But when BDNF levels are low, that doesn't happen. And it's low in people who have mild cognitive impairment, dementia, who don't exercise, who eat a high-fat diet, and on and on. So how do we keep BDNF level up? Because it not only promotes new neurons, especially in the hippocampus, it protects cells from death, nerve cells from death. It promotes new synapses, which are the junctions in between neurons that help create greater connectivity, a higher level of brain function. It also assists in the formation of memory. So we want to keep BDNF levels high, so we want to exercise aerobically regularly. Exercise reduces inflammation. I mentioned that before, because inflammation is there at all stages of the disease and gets worse and worse over time. It reduces hypertension. We talked about that. It not only slows the rate of brain loss or volume loss of the brain, you can actually grow your brain with exercise. Now get this, 60 to 80-year-old Americans just performing aerobic exercise 3 times a week at 60 to 70% of their max heart rate, we can talk about that later on, heart rate, increase their brain volume significantly in just 6 months. That was reported in the Journal of Gerontology, and other journals have reported similar outcomes with similar studies. So regular exercise slows, and in some cases even reverses cognitive decline. Wow. It increases connectivity between neurons, so you have a higher level of brain function, and it makes the brain more plastic and adaptive to any assault it may be exposed to. The 2 studies I want to mention to you that are fascinating. One is Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. They placed something called actigraphs on 716 individuals and basically set them loose for 3.5 years. Those devices measured how much activity they were getting. At the end of the 3.5 years, they put together a chart, and they looked at who was the most physically active and who was the least. They found that those who were in the bottom 10% for physical activity had 2.3 times elevated risk that they would go on to develop Alzheimer's compared to those who were in the top 10%. And not only does exercise increase blood flow when we exercise in the brain, but increases the amount of blood vessels in the brain. We call that angiogenesis. And Columbia University found that just after 3 months of regular aerobic exercise, capillary volume, the little blood vessels in the hippocampus, increased 30%. This is powerful medicine. This is something all of us could benefit from. Now, even after a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, those who are exercising regularly they fare much better because they slow the rate of their decline by about 1/3. So really critical to fit exercise in, regular daily exercise. I want to talk to you about alcohol consumption now. This is another thing that we've been sold a bill of goods on. Alcohol consumption is particularly associated with early onset Alzheimer's. And I consider it an emerging factor because we've heard for way too long that a little bit of alcohol gives you an edge on your health, lowers your risk for cardiovascular disease. Well, guess what? The new research turns everything you've heard up on its end. The new research, including a massive study of 500,000 people tracked for over a decade, has shown that we've actually been misled about alcohol when it comes to the brain. And across all demographics in America, especially women, we're drinking more alcohol than ever before. At least 10 drinks a week on average, 500 drinks a year, and about 15 million of us have an alcohol use disorder. Alcohol is toxic to every cell in the body. It changes brain function. It changes the physical shape of the brain. It causes neuroinflammation. There it is again, inflammation in the brain. It interferes with the brain's ability to form new memories. It impairs neurogenesis, or the production of new neurons in the hippocampus, the memory epicenter, and it shrinks the brain. There we go again, at an accelerated rate. It raises blood pressure, which you know now is deleterious for the brain, and it interferes with the absorption of brain-critical vitamins B1, B12, and folic acid, and it's contaminated with lead and pesticides, both of which are directly threatening to the brain. So another thing to reconsider if you're serious about maximally protecting your brain. Finally, I want to talk to you about insomnia. Now, insomnia is defined as the inability to fall asleep or remain asleep after you fall asleep, and it now affects about 60 million Americans. Have you ever heard anybody speak pridefully about how little sleep they get? It's like in our culture of productivity, somehow it equates to getting a lot done if you don't sleep a lot. The bad news is insufficient sleep is a major risk factor for dementia, Alzheimer's disease specifically. One of the reasons is the levels of amyloid, which is the protein that the plaques that develop in the brain are composed of, they're regulated by the sleep-wake cycle. So during wake periods, amyloid's highest, and they go down when we sleep, okay? So if we're not sleeping or we're deprived of sleep, those amyloid levels are going to be up longer, extended duration. And with sleep deprivation, yes, they not only go up, but our bodies or our brain's ability to clear that amyloid from the brain is compromised. Now, it's during deep sleep when our brain actually shrinks. And it does this temporarily to afford a whole cleansing process to take place. Our brain uses cerebral spinal fluid to flush out amyloid, tau, the protein that forms the neurofibrillary tangles, and other metabolic waste that's accumulated throughout the day. And if we're not sleeping or getting insufficient amounts of sleep, this process can be compromised, which allows more of this metabolic waste, potentially neurotoxic, to build up in the brain. And we all know how we feel when we don't get enough sleep. So I ask you a question in the morning and you say, I don't know, I can't process that right now. Ask me later on. We just can't seem to get up and running. It's like the junctions, the connections between our synapses are gummed up, it almost feels like. So sleep is the time when your brain encodes and consolidates new memories into long-time storage. It's when new neurons are born. It's when cortisol levels should drop, but if we're not sleeping, they're going to rise up. It's when melatonin should rise, but if we're not sleeping, we're interfering with that production too, the sleep hormone. Blood pressure should drop when we sleep, but if we're not sleeping, blood pressure is elevated. Insulin levels should drop. Same thing, heart rate should lower, and these general maintenance processes should occur. So we've got to look at sleep hygiene. Are we sleeping in a dark room? Do we have ambient light that's bothering us? Clocks, phones, chargers, street lights, alarm keypads. Do we need blackout curtains or an eye mask in order to create a dark room? Because your eye has sensors that detect light even when your lids are shut. And that can interfere with melatonin production and your ability to get a good night's sleep. If you eat earlier in the day, eating at 5 or 6, if you eat late, you disrupt production and release of melatonin again. Remove your cell phone from the bedroom. The radio frequency that it projects reduces the production of a neurohormone called B-trace protein, which supports sleep. Avoid caffeinated beverages entirely. It's coffee, tea, colas, etc. Or at least don't have them late in the day. Cool your room to 65 degrees, take a hot bath before bed, Invest in a great bed because you spend all that time there, and you want to make sure it really supports you. And if you're dealing with like a sleep disorder or something like restless leg syndrome or sleep apnea, you can contact the Sleep Foundation, the National Sleep Foundation at sleepfoundation.org, and they can provide assistance to getting support with that. So now I want to talk to you about the single most important step you can take to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. Without question, people ask me all the time, if I can only make one choice or take one action, of course, none of us can just take one action, what would it be? And I say, without a doubt, it's diet. Because your diet, the single action, adopting a plant-centered diet, a healthful diet, can address a whole range of risk factors, including heart disease, stroke, hypertension, cholesterol levels, diabetes, insulin resistance, overweight, obesity, insomnia, oxidative stress, and inflammation. And what appears over and over to show up as the best choice we can make is a plant-centered diet. It's a diet that is built upon fruits and vegetables, leafy greens, legumes, and whole grains. This diet delivers the highest concentration of protective antioxidants, compounds that reduce inflammation, and that protect the brain in a multitude of different ways. Yeah. And you've probably heard about the Seventh-day Adventists. They're known for their healthy lifestyle, and they're often recruited to participate in health studies because, well, in general, they live about 10 years longer than the average American. And many of them, not all, but many of them are vegetarians, and some of them are vegans, meaning they avoid all animal products in their diet. Well, a team of researchers came along and they said, this is a great group to study because some are still eating meat and some have avoided meat long-term over their life. And they wanted to see if there was any difference in their chances of developing Alzheimer's disease further down the road. And they found that those who were still eating meat compared to those who avoided meat at all times were up to 3 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's eventually. Important finding. There's another study that looked at 12 different countries and looked at which foods created the highest chance that someone was going to develop Alzheimer's later on. They found meat consumption to be number 1 risk, and that was followed by egg consumption and then fish. Ooh. So why is this? Well, there may be several contributing factors that raise risk, not the least of which is the saturated fat in the diet. And we know saturated fat is problematic. We know it's problematic with vascular disease. The Chicago Health and Aging Project, which is a longitudinal study of about 6,000 subjects, they, again, measured saturated fat intake. And they found that those who consumed the most saturated fat had over 3 times the risk that they would go on to develop Alzheimer's compared to those who were consuming the least amount of saturated fat. Well, where's saturated fat? It's concentrated in meat and dairy, okay? It's not concentrated in plant foods, with the exception of tropical oils, which tend to be high in saturated fat. But that's not what makes up a plant-centered diet. Now, a plant-centered diet also lowers cholesterol because it doesn't contain cholesterol, and it's low in saturated fat, which stimulates the liver to produce cholesterol. Is cholesterol a risk factor? Yeah. In fact, people who have a total cholesterol level of 250 milligrams per deciliter at midlife have a 3-fold increase that they'll go on to develop Alzheimer's compared to those who are maintaining moderate cholesterol levels. Now, in the US, that number right there accounts for 30 million Americans. So even moderately elevated levels of cholesterol at midlife have been shown to increase risk for dementia later on compared to people who are maintaining healthy levels of cholesterol. And once Alzheimer's is developed, it also advances much more rapidly in those who have high blood cholesterol levels. So remember, cholesterol is not found in any plant foods, but it's found in meat, cheese, eggs, fish, all these foods that are also rich in saturated fat, which stimulates the liver to make more cholesterol. So I realize that some of what I've just presented to you can be really unsettling to hear. But the good news is that all of these risk factors, including many that I haven't addressed today, are things we can address. They're lifestyle choices. And today, you can address them all. You can start taking steps right away to take control of your lifestyle, make wise, healthful choices about the food you're eating, the beverages you're consuming, and the amount of exercise you're getting every day. And the mounting evidence indicates that doing so is going to give us a really serious chance at preventing Alzheimer's disease, as well as maintaining cognitive resilience throughout our life.
Wow. Fantastic. So I learn so much from you every time I hear you. I always think I know everything, and then I realize I don't. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm sure everybody has lots of questions, which we can do later. But for now, how do people get a hold of you if they want to know more from you specifically?
They can visit my website, josephkeon.com, and there's an email there for contact. I'd love to hear from anyone.
Wonderful. I knew about alcohol, but I didn't know all the parts of alcohol. So that's amazing, because so many people think, oh, just a couple glasses a night will be fine. But I guess there's no really safe amount of alcohol, right?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. We've all heard these recommendations and seen these guidelines that somehow moderate alcohol intake was supposed to be protective.
Yeah.
And I think many people have embraced those recommendations. But one of these studies was fascinating to read because the researchers themselves were stunned by the findings. They said, "Wow,
Oh, yeah.
we did not expect this at
Yeah.
all." And
Fairly new, right? Fairly new information.
it is really what
Yeah.
I call it. I put it in my section of emerging risk factors that we really need to devote more attention to in terms of educating the public about, because the other message has been there way too long.
Yeah.
Leading us.
It's been there a long time. And I know about the sleep thing. If I don't sleep well and I have to get up the next morning and teach aerobics, and I have to remember the whole sequence of events and that, okay, halfway through the workout, I'm going, okay, what was I supposed
What
to do?
am I doing?
I don't know what to do. Help. So I just make up something and go from there.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph Keon. You're amazing, and thank you for your research and your work. It's fabulous.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.